January 1943, somewhere above the restless Pacific, a thin gray line of cloud stretched beneath a lone American fighter climbing hard into the cold morning sky. The engine's deep, rising note rolled through the cockpit like a physical force, shaking metal that had only recently left the factory floor. Below lay a world of scattered islands and widening war, where every mile of airspace was contested and every encounter carried the weight of survival. The pilot steadied his breathing as sunlight flickered across the bent wings of the aircraft that many still dismissed as unstable, overpowered, even clumsy. Far ahead, a formation of Japanese aircraft cut across the horizon, experienced men flying machines designed for agility and steeped in early war dominance. Reports had circulated that this new American fighter was no match for them, that its bulk and temperamental handling made it little more than a loud target. Yet as the distance closed and altitude bled away, the truth of what this machine could do was about to be written in the air, setting the stage for the forces that built the conflict behind it. By early 1943, the Pacific Theater had settled into a brutal rhythm of attrition, expansion, and adaptation. A vast maritime battlefield where aircraft determined not only the pace of operations, but the psychological balance between empires. The Japanese Navy, carried by its early war momentum, still fielded veteran pilots, shaped by years of combat over China and the Pacific, men who flew with remarkable discipline and confidence in machines like the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft whose extraordinary range, maneuverability, and climb rate had stunned Western observers and forced Allied planners to confront the weaknesses of their own pre-war designs. Across countless engagements in 1941 and 1942, Japanese fighters carved a reputation that filtered through every command room and squadron tent. They turned tighter, accelerated faster, and responded instantly to skilled hands. American and Allied pilots learned quickly that entering a slow, turning fight was suicidal, and early encounters produced both tactical respect and a deeply ingrained caution. The United States, however, was rapidly transforming its aviation landscape, having already invested heavily in engines, airframes, and metallurgical processes capable of supporting mass-produced high-performance fighters. Engineers at Chance Vought had spent the late 1930s and early 1940s developing a radical new design built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful air-cooled engines of its era, producing a level of thrust that demanded equally radical solutions. The inverted gull wing, long nose, and tall stance of the F4U reflected not stylistic choice, but practical engineering. The wing needed to sit high enough for a huge propeller, and the fuselage needed to accommodate both an oversized engine and a wide-set undercarriage suitable for hard carrier landings. But ambitious engineering rarely enters combat without complications, and the Corsair's early reputation suffered from visibility issues on approach, landing bounce, and structural quirks that unnerved naval test pilots. Many within the U.S. Navy doubted the aircraft's future aboard carriers, leading to a temporary shift that placed early production Corsairs into the hands of the U.S. Marine Corps and British Fleet Air Arm, forces that would test the fighter from island bases long before its return to carrier decks. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence analysts monitored the arrival of new American aircraft with practiced skepticism. Many assumed the Corsair's size and unconventional shape reflected excess rather than effectiveness, and initial impressions suggested that its climb and maneuverability would fall short of the A6M. But beneath such assessments, the strategic environment was shifting. Aircraft production in the United States surged beyond anything Japan could match. Pilot training pipelines expanded, and new designs matured at a pace driven by relentless industrial capability. Guadalcanal, Buna, and the Solomons demonstrated that the era of easy Japanese aerial superiority was eroding, replaced by a contest of skill, material strength, and evolving technology. Every new fighter entering the arena carried the weight of national expectations, and each encounter in the Pacific sky became a test of doctrine as much as machinery. As U.S. forces pushed outward from their early defensive posture, the quality of their aircraft would play a decisive role in establishing air corridors, defending convoys, and supporting amphibious operations. And in this emerging landscape, the F4U's capabilities would soon reshape assumptions on both sides of the conflict. Yet to understand how a pilot's mockery could transform into shock, one must first explore how this aircraft, dismissed by some and feared by others, developed into a machine capable of challenging Japan's most respected fighters, setting the groundwork for the deeper context that followed. As the Corsair entered broader service through 1943, its story became inseparable from the environments and pilots that tested it, revealing a machine whose early controversies masked a level of performance that few had yet witnessed in sustained combat. Engineers continued refining the airframe, smoothing out aerodynamic irregularities along the wing roots and cowling, adjusting oil cooler inlets, and implementing minor but important changes to landing gear damping and tailhook behavior. These incremental improvements gradually transformed an unpredictable prototype into a stable high-speed platform with exceptional dive characteristics and blistering acceleration in level flight. The sort of fighter that rewarded energy retention rather than tight radius maneuvering. Meanwhile, the British Fleet Air Arm, facing different tactical demands and operating from escort carriers with tighter deck space, accelerated the process of adapting carrier procedures to the Corsair. British pilots adopted curved approaches that preserved forward visibility during landing, a technique the U.S. Navy would later incorporate when the aircraft re-entered carrier service. Yet it was in the island campaigns at Bougainville, New Georgia, and the extended Solomon Islands corridor that the F4U found its first opportunities to demonstrate what the massive double Wasp engine could truly deliver against experienced Japanese aviators. Here the skies formed a crucible where endurance, altitude, and instantaneous decisions determined survival. Many Japanese units, depleted by losses in the preceding year, increasingly relied on pilots with less training time than their predecessors, a harsh contrast to the elite groups that had dominated early war engagements. Still, the Zero remained dangerous, particularly in the hands of seasoned survivors who understood how to force opponents into tight maneuvers that drained energy and left heavy American fighters vulnerable. These veterans observed the Corsair with mixed curiosity and dismissal. They noted its speed but doubted its ability to maintain control at lower velocities, believing its size and high wing loading created exploitable weaknesses. Their assessments filtered into intelligence circles and later into briefing rooms, shaping the early reputation of the F4U among Japanese pilots who often entered battle assuming technological superiority against anything that did not match the Zero's design philosophy. Meanwhile, U.S. Marine aviators flying from rough island airstrips discovered that the Corsair's rugged frame absorbed punishment well, its wide stance and strong landing gear suiting the uneven terrain better than many expected. Reports circulated noting the aircraft's ability to outrun or outclimb enemy fighters under specific conditions, though these observations were still weighed against its landing and low-speed quirks. Combat frequencies intensified, and pilots gradually learned that altitude and speed, rather than horizontal turns, defined the aircraft's natural strengths. Hit-and-run diving attacks, slashing passes, and controlled vertical maneuvers allowed the Corsair to dictate engagement terms, and each new sortie added to a growing body of tactical knowledge. Slowly, the narrative that once framed the fighter as clumsy began to shift, driven by real combat experience and the increasingly obvious fact that the aircraft's raw power opened doors to maneuvers Japanese pilots were not accustomed to countering. Yet perceptions, both enemy and allied, rarely shift overnight, and the disconnect between early mockery and emerging battlefield reality created a tension that would shape the encounters still ahead. It is within these layers, technical evolution, contrasting doctrines, and human assumptions, that the deeper angles of this story begin to emerge. Behind every assessment of the Corsair, every remark of praise, skepticism, or outright mockery, stood the human dimension of a war fought by men who carried both pride and fear into the sky. Japanese pilots, trained within a culture that valued precision, discipline, and mastery of the Zero's elegant handling, approached aerial combat with a confidence born from early war dominance. Many had learned over China and Southeast Asia that agility, patience, and tight radius maneuvering could dismantle heavier Western fighters in minutes. Their reputations were not illusions. They had earned them through experience and loss. Thus, when reports emerged of a new American fighter with broad wings, a massive engine, and a nose so long that pilots struggled to see the runway on landing, the instinctive reaction among many in Japanese units was disbelief that such a machine could challenge their hard-won advantages. But the tactical landscape was shifting, shaped by a growing understanding of energy fighting, where speed, altitude, and vertical maneuvering gradually replaced the turning duels that had defined earlier clashes. American and Marine Corps pilots discovered that the F4U sheer power allowed it to enter engagements with momentum few Japanese fighters could match. Rather than pulling in a level turns where the Zero held the advantage, Corsair pilots attacked from above in fast, controlled dives, using the aircraft's weight and aerodynamics to retain energy through the strike. These slashing attacks demanded discipline. A pilot who lingered too long risked bleeding speed and inviting the Zero's tighter turning circle to close in. But when flown to its strengths, the F4U reversed familiar dynamics, forcing Japanese fighters into defensive climbs where the Corsair's engine delivered overwhelming superiority. This shift challenged long-standing assumptions on both sides. The technological contrast between the two fighters revealed the evolving nature of wartime aviation. The Zero, designed for unmatched agility, traded armor and structural reinforcement for lightness, while the Corsair embodied the American philosophy of raw power, ruggedness, and high-speed stability. Its bent wing accommodated a massive propeller and reduced landing gear length, while the R-2800 engine generated a thrust envelope that pushed the aircraft to speeds previously unreachable by carrier-based fighters. Pilots who mastered its quirks found themselves commanding an aircraft capable of sudden vertical climbs, rapid dives, and braking speeds that left enemy formations struggling to respond. Japanese aviators, trained to exploit slow-speed maneuvering, often reacted with surprise when the Corsair refused to lose altitude or energy in the predictable ways earlier U.S. fighters had. Combat reports describe moments when Japanese pilots attempted to initiate familiar turning traps, only to watch their American opponent simply climb away, invert, and re-enter the fight from a dominant angle. Beneath these encounters lay the psychological weight of adaptation. The Corsair demanded new habits, new instincts, and a trust in mechanical force rather than delicate balance. Those who embraced this shift found themselves flying a machine that could reshape engagements before the enemy understood what was happening. Yet the tensions between old doctrine and emerging capability lingered in every squadron tent and briefing room. Veterans of the early Solomon campaigns remembered the confidence with which Japanese pilots had once entered combat. Their dives sharp, their turns precise, their early war superiority almost unquestioned. Now a different pattern emerged, one where speed and altitude dictated survival, and where the Corsair's massive frame no longer signaled clumsiness but potential. These evolving perceptions formed only part of the broader picture, because behind tactics and machinery were the leadership philosophies and operational pressures that defined how each side deployed its fighters, setting the stage for deeper angles that shaped the coming confrontations. Leadership decisions on both sides shaped how the Corsair's capabilities unfolded in combat, revealing a contrast between Japanese doctrine rooted in pre-war confidence and American command structures. Increasingly driven by data, logistics, and evolving battlefield realities. Japanese naval leadership, still influenced by the extraordinary victories of 1941 and early 1942, viewed aircraft like the Zero as extensions of a long-proven philosophy built on pilot skill, lightweight construction, and exceptional low-speed control. This approach required fighters to dominate through maneuver, strike with precision, and rely on elite aviators to compensate for structural vulnerabilities. Yet as losses mounted in Japan's pilot training pipeline struggled to replace its veterans, leadership found itself relying on the same doctrines with diminishing numbers of pilots capable of executing them. In contrast, American leadership embraced rapid adaptation. Engineering teams, squadron commanders, and fleet planners exchanged information continuously, feeding operational feedback back into manufacturing lines and tactical manuals. Reports describing the Corsair's dive stability, acceleration, and ability to regain altitude quickly were incorporated into training programs with unusual speed for wartime conditions. Commanders recognized that even if the aircraft remained imperfect in carrier operations, its raw performance made it invaluable for land-based Marine squadrons who needed every possible advantage against entrenched Japanese positions. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, intelligence officers studying wreckage, pilot accounts, and intercepted reports attempted to categorize the F4U within familiar frameworks. Many initially assumed it followed the same limitations as earlier U.S. fighters: heavy, less responsive, and vulnerable in a close-in turning engagement. This perception filtered into briefing rooms, where younger, less experienced pilots internalized assessments that no longer represented the changing reality of American aircraft design. The psychological effect of this miscalculation grew more pronounced as encounters increased. When a Corsair accelerated upward out of range, instead of slowing into predictable turning patterns, it upended expectations forged through years of instruction. Such mismatches between doctrine and reality often proved decisive, not because one side lacked bravery or skill, but because air combat punishes outdated assumptions more severely than almost any other battlefield environment. Yet, even as leadership on both sides grappled with the shifting balance of technology, the moral undercurrent of the conflict remained present, one that weighed heavily on the men flying these machines. Japanese pilots fought under a doctrine that framed death in combat as honorable and expected, a code that reinforced aggression even when strategic logic might have favored withdrawal. American pilots carried their own burdens: the pressure of expanding operations across the Pacific, the responsibility of supporting ground forces advancing through unforgiving island terrain, and the growing understanding that technological superiority did not erase the dangers of every engagement. These competing mental frameworks influenced how pilots perceive their opponents. Respect, underestimation, and fear mixed in complex ways depending on experience. By the time the Corsair's full capabilities began to emerge in mid-war combat zones, the stage was set for confrontations where outdated assumptions collided with unexpected performance, leaving moments of shock etched into after-action reports on both sides. And it was within one such encounter, born from confidence, misjudgment, and the accelerating pace of aerial innovation, that the story's decisive turning point would soon unfold. By mid-1943, the skies above the northern Solomons had become a narrow corridor of contested airspace, a place where altitude determined advantage, and every formation knew that the first sighting often dictated the outcome. On a clear morning during one of these routine intercept missions, a group of Japanese fighters, experienced pilots mixed with younger replacements, moved along the coastline at cruising altitude, maintaining a loose defensive spread designed to draw American aircraft into turning engagements they believed they would inevitably win. Among them was a veteran aviator whose earlier encounters with American machines had reinforced his view that U.S. fighters were fast but graceless, unable to match the fine control and sensitivity of a Zero in the hands of a trained pilot. He had heard of the new bent-wing American aircraft, dismissed it as excessive, and confidently briefed his younger wingmen that any large, heavy fighter could be forced into a stall if pressured at the right moment. Climbing several thousand feet above them, a division of Marine F4U Corsairs moved into position after ground radar reported enemy activity pushing south along the island chain. Their leader signaled for a shallow dive, using the sun to mask the descent, and as the altimeters unwound, the airframe began to hum with the familiar vibration of the double Wasp engine approaching peak output. The pilots knew the rules for this machine: no turning traps, no hesitation, strike with speed, then climb back into the vertical before the enemy could bleed them of energy. The moment the Corsairs emerged from the glare, the Japanese formation reacted instantly, breaking outward in practiced arcs meant to pull the Americans into horizontal chases. For years, this maneuver had granted Japanese fighters the upper hand, drawing opponents into spiraling turns where light airframes and tight controls delivered decisive kills. But the Corsairs did not follow the script. Instead, they kept the dive shallow, maintained speed, and swept through the formation with high-velocity bursts that forced their opponents into defensive climbs rather than level turns. The veteran Japanese pilot recognized the pattern too late. These Americans were not attempting to turn with him. He pulled his aircraft into a rising arc designed to force an overshoot, but the Corsair above him simply climbed steeper, using raw horsepower to extend the vertical gap before inverting and dropping back in a firing position. The maneuver violated everything he expected from a heavy Western fighter. His younger wingmen, trained on tactics that relied on inducing low-speed engagements, found themselves out of position as the Corsairs regrouped, climbed again, and repeated their slashing attacks with mechanical precision. The veteran pilot tried once more to draw the nearest Corsair into a horizontal fight, but the American held altitude, rolled sharply, and converted height into speed in a controlled dive that closed the distance in seconds. Witnesses later noted how quickly the engagement shifted from confidence to alarm among the Japanese fighters, as the realization spread that the new American aircraft could dictate the fight's geometry from start to finish. In that brief but decisive sequence, the assumptions that had guided Japanese pilots for years began to fracture, revealing a confrontation where the expected limitations of a clumsy enemy fighter no longer applied. And as the Corsairs climbed for yet another attack run, the battle entered the moment where shock would turn into unmistakable clarity. The final moments of the engagement unfolded with a clarity that left little room for interpretation among those who survived it. As the Corsairs completed their climb and rolled once more into attack position, the Japanese formation had already lost its cohesion, forced into scattered defensive maneuvers that reflected the growing realization that the battle's familiar rhythms no longer applied. The veteran pilot who had once briefed his men with quiet certainty now found himself relying on instinct alone, his aircraft straining as he attempted to force the engagement back toward the low-speed turning fight, where he still believed he held an advantage. But the Corsair above him held every meaningful parameter, altitude, speed, and initiative, and when it dropped into its final diving pass, the sequence unfolded with a mechanical inevitability that reflected the shifting balance of the air war itself. The American pilot controlled the dive with measured precision, firing only when the closing angle aligned cleanly, sending a stream of .50 caliber rounds that tore through the Japanese fighter's wing before the veteran could complete his evasive roll. Trailing smoke, his aircraft began to lose lift, drifting downward in a wide arc that mirrored countless combat reports from the period, each describing how a single burst from the Corsair's guns could cripple even well-flown enemy machines. The younger Japanese pilots, witnessing their leaders fall, attempted to press upward in a desperate counterattack, but the Corsairs simply climbed out of reach, using vertical maneuvering to break pursuit before re-entering from dominant angles. The engagement lasted only minutes, yet within that brief space the Japanese pilots experienced a reversal that previous years of battle had not prepared them for. Instead of dictating the fight through agility, they found themselves reacting to an enemy who no longer played by the old rules. When the final Corsair withdrew to rejoin its division, the sky carried the quiet aftermath of a contest defined not by chance, but by the undeniable performance gap revealed in full view. Surviving Japanese aircraft retreated northward, maintaining radio silence, each pilot processing the implications of what had unfolded. Reports filed later would note the surprising speed, climb, and dive characteristics of the new American fighter, marking the encounter as one of the first clear indicators that U.S. carrier-borne aviation had entered a new technological phase. On the American side, the pilots returned with a sober understanding of what their aircraft could achieve when flown to its strengths, recognizing that the F4U's power was not simply a matter of design, but of disciplined employment. What had begun as an interception had become a demonstration, An unmistakable moment where a machine once dismissed as unstable and ungainly had proven itself capable of reshaping the outcome of aerial combat. It was this encounter, repeated in variations across the Pacific as the war advanced, that transformed perception into reality, laying the foundation for the strategic and psychological shifts that followed. In the hours and days that followed the engagement, both sides began to grasp the deeper significance of what had occurred, not as an isolated skirmish, but as a marker of the evolving balance in the Pacific Air War. American intelligence officers reviewing pilot debriefs immediately noted the clarity with which the Corsair's strengths had emerged. Its superior climb rate allowed it to disengage at will. Its dive speed outmatched the Zero by a wide margin, and its rugged airframe absorbed the stresses of repeated high-energy maneuvers without structural compromise. Maintenance crews inspecting returning aircraft found little more than routine wear, a testament to the durability built into its design. Four Marine commanders coordinating operations across increasingly contested front lines. These reports carried strategic implications. Air superiority was not simply a tactical advantage. It was a prerequisite for every amphibious landing, every supply convoy, every island outpost struggling to hold position under threat from the north. The Corsairs' demonstrated ability to reshape aerial engagements strengthened confidence that American forces could extend their reach deeper into Japanese-held territory without suffering the disproportionate losses that had characterized earlier phases of the war. Yet on the Japanese side, the encounter produced a different kind of clarity, one shaped by rising concern and an unspoken recognition that the technological and industrial balance had shifted too far to ignore. Surviving pilots filed reports noting the American aircraft's exceptional acceleration and its baffling ability to climb vertically after high-speed passes, behaviors that contradicted pre-war assumptions about heavy radial engine fighters. Intelligence analysts, already aware of the widening gap in production capacity, now faced evidence that U.S. design philosophy had advanced beyond mere incremental improvement. What troubled them most was not simply that a new aircraft had outperformed the Zero, but that the Americans had developed a fighter capable of sustaining high-energy combat, something Japan's strained industry could not counter with rapid new designs. Meanwhile, within Japanese squadrons, the psychological effect lingered. Pilots who had once relied on the certainty of their aircraft's maneuvering advantage now found themselves confronting an enemy machine that operated according to a different logic entirely. The erosion of confidence was subtle at first, visible in more cautious tactics, higher engagement altitudes, and an increasing reliance on defensive climbs rather than the aggressive turning maneuvers once emblematic of Japanese doctrine. As combat moved steadily northward across the Pacific archipelagos, these shifts compounded, contributing to a broader pattern that would shape later battles. And it was in this emerging landscape, where shock blended with adaptation and where tactical memory began to rewrite itself, that the longer-term consequences of the encounter took root. As the months progressed and the Corsair entered wider service, the larger consequences of its emergence became impossible to overlook, shaping not only tactical doctrine but the strategic psychology of the Pacific conflict. Production ramped at a pace that only American industry could sustain, sending hundreds of new F4Us into Marine squadrons and, eventually, back onto the decks of U.S. Navy carriers once landing procedures improved and minor design refinements stabilized carrier operations. The aircraft that had once been restricted to land bases now launched from flat tops across the Central Pacific, allowing the United States to project high-performance fighter strength far beyond earlier operational limits. Reports from subsequent operations at Kwajalein, Saipan, and the Philippine Sea demonstrated that Japanese pilots increasingly struggled to counter the Corsair's speed and firepower, particularly as their own aircraft designs, hampered by limited resources and outdated production capabilities, failed to match the accelerating American curve. The Zero, though still deadly in skilled hands, could no longer impose the terms of engagement. Instead, it was the Corsair and its contemporaries that dictated altitude, timing, and aggression. Within Japanese command circles, This shift forced a sobering reassessment of the air war's trajectory. Logistical shortages, declining pilot quality, and the inability to field a next-generation fighter in meaningful numbers meant that each new American design exerted pressure far beyond its immediate combat effect. Meanwhile, American squadrons learned to blend the F4U's power with increasingly coordinated tactics, mutual support formations, altitude management, and strict engagement discipline, creating an environment where Japanese units, once accustomed to tactical dominance, found themselves reacting rather than initiating. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Corsair had become an emblem of American air strength, credited not only with air-to-air victories, but also with ground attack missions that supported the island-hopping strategy, driving U.S. forces steadily closer to Japan. The aircraft's operational success even extended beyond American service, as British and New Zealand units integrated the fighter into their Pacific operations with notable results. Across these developments, the psychological thread remained constant. The early encounters that had once prompted Japanese pilots to mock the bulky American fighter had given way to a widespread recognition that the war in the air had entered a new phase, one defined not by delicate maneuvers, but by overwhelming power, industrial momentum, and the cumulative impact of machines like the F4U. And as the conflict moved into its final years, the story of that shift carried a meaning that stretched far beyond a single battle or a single aircraft, preparing the ground for the broader reflection that history would draw from this transformation. In the long view of history, the story of the Corsair's rise serves as a reminder that wars are shaped not only by courage or experience, but by the willingness of nations and individuals to adapt when familiar truths no longer hold. The Japanese pilot who once dismissed the new American fighter as clumsy had not misjudged out of arrogance alone. He had relied on patterns that had defined his world since the first days of the war, patterns reinforced by victories and by an aircraft that had once dominated every opponent it met. But the Pacific conflict evolved faster than doctrine could keep pace, and in that shifting landscape the Corsair became a symbol of what happens when engineering ambition, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation converge at the right moment. Its power did not erase the skill of its opponents, nor did it lessen the human cost carried by pilots on both sides who fought in skies filled with uncertainty and fire. Instead, it illuminated the quiet truth that technological superiority is never a single event, but a gradual shaping of momentum, turning narrow encounters into turning points and turning points into irreversible trends. The battles in which the F4U proved itself were not merely contests of speed or altitude. They reflected a broader transformation in the Pacific War, a movement from the fragile dominance of early Japanese aviation to the expansive force of an American industrial machine capable of redefining the terms of combat. And within that transformation lies the human lesson. That confidence, no matter how deeply earned, must constantly confront the realities unfolding beyond one's expectations. The Corsair's story endures not because it humiliated an opponent, but because it marked the moment when the balance of the air war shifted decisively, carried forward by a machine that exceeded every doubt placed upon it.